Is Raul Reyes, attorney and NBCNews.com contributor. Noelle Nikpour, Republican strategist and author of Branding America, and Jose Aristimuño, former press secretary for the Democratic National Committee and a Democratic strategist. Raul, to you first. NBC News among the first news organizations given access to that overcrowded Casa Padre facility in Texas. Here's how my colleague Jacob Soboroff described that facility.
This place is called a shelter, but effectively these kids are incarcerated. There are 1,400 of them, over 1,400 of them, that are spending not weeks, months inside this place. They're not actually literally in cages or in cells, but I kid you not, one of the first things an employee of the shelter said to me is, when we walked inside, can you try to smile at these kids? Because it's weird to see people from the outside. They feel like animals locked up in cages being looked at. It was an extraordinary thing to see.
Difficult to imagine some of those conditions, but what's the reality legally? What's the legal process for some of these migrant children who are in these centers, and how do they move forward?
Well, to be very blunt, right now we are in uncharted territory because no other administration has mandated this separation of families simply for the act of crossing the border. And many of them, especially these groups of Central Americans, do have a legal right to asylum. Mm-hmm. Now, under past administrations, children who are unaccompanied would be turned over to Health and Human Services and try to be placed with a relative somewhere else in the country. However, now, under the Trump administration, because the parents are being sent to prison, for jail while they await their prosecution, the children are being put in these tent cities and these holding shelters that are being done so quickly. And the problem is these are already overcrowded. That 2,000, that figure we saw of 2,000 kids over the last 6 weeks, that is an undercount because it does not include children who are separated from their parents at points of entry. So the process is they will now be hopefully placed with some type of sponsor or governmental sponsor or social worker who can handle them. But we have to remember, even under the Obama administration, as far back as 2014, the immigration courts, the social services down in these sectors of the border, they were overwhelmed. There's not enough legal representation. The detention centers are in very remote locations. And now, very quickly, we're going to be seeing a large influx of children into the system. So we don't know what's going to happen. What we do know, unfortunately, some of these children, their parents have already been deported. So even as their cases proceed, there might not be a close family member for them to be reunited with.
So there are some on the right who've compared these family separations to criminals being separated from their children. Legally speaking, what's the difference between the two?
There's a huge difference. Listen, first of all, if the argument is that in this country, if someone, a U.S. citizen parent commits a crime, they go to prison, they don't have their kids with them either. The difference is, in the United States, if you go to jail or prison, your child is assigned a social worker, a caseworker, a court-sponsored attorney. There's a whole process, it varies by locality, but there's a whole process to ensure the best interests of the child. Even someone who is in prison who is a serial murderer is allowed to call their child and knows where their child is. These undocumented people do not have any of those rights. Undocumented people do have the right to a lawyer legally, however, not at government expense. So that means the overwhelming majority of them do not have lawyers, especially these kids. And in immigration court, and this is not exaggeration because I have seen it, any immigration attorney who's worked with children can tell you, sometimes you have children facing an immigration judge who are 3 months, 6 months. They are toddlers. You have, in some courtrooms, stuffed animals to occupy the children while they go through this process. So it's a huge difference from how things happen for U.S. citizens dealing with our criminal justice system.
I appreciate that insight. Noelle, I want to ask you, the images that we're seeing from these tent cities are just really hard to process, and these are just the ones that we've been allowed access to, these detention centers as well. How does the GOP defend this policy and these images, especially with the midterms now just a few months away?
Well, I mean, if you'll take a look, there are some GOP, legislators that are not a fan of this. I don't really, taking partisan politics out of it, as a human being, this is a horrendous occurrence that's happening with these children. These are children that are being affected by this. And to go a step further, they were saying, some people on the right, which I'm a GOP strategist, and they're saying that a lot of these adults that are bringing some of these children through, that they're not really totally sure that 100% of them, that those are their children, in fact. So one of the things that they're doing is when they have the children there, they are giving these children, they have counselors for the children, as you know. They have food, they have water, they have activities, things for them to do to keep them active. It's not an ideal situation, so I don't want you to think for one moment that I'm defending these camps. One of the things that a lot of Republicans are working on would be to, have situations where you have the parents and the children together while you're going through this process. But that can be, as you know, if you do that, that can be months and months at a time. I think President Trump, he even tweeted out, I think you guys will remember, he tweeted out and he said something like, it's horrible what's happening with the people, the children being separated from their parents, fund the wall. So basically, I think he's saying, he's putting it back on the Democrats' back to say, if you would only fund this wall, which is the main thing that I asked for, and that's the main thing that he ran on. Do you remember when he came down the escalator and it was like, build the wall, build the wall? So that was his main campaign slogan. So he is going to get that wall funded. So he's pushing it back on the Democrats, going, this situation over here with the parents and the children separated, that's on the Democrats' back, is what Trump's saying.